Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems. The ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve while rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy Time Tales for a few nights to get used to the slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get on to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a few minutes of your time. Sleepy Time Tales is a listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going and pay for the services and tools that I use and justify the time that I spend on it, thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you're finding Sleepy Time Tales useful, if it helps you to get a restful night and you would like to keep it going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, and you have the means to help me to keep it going, please consider supporting it on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that helps me keep the lights on and can get you bonuses based on your contribution level. So go along, take a look, and sign up if you're willing. And of course, if monthly seems like a big ask, you can make once-off tips to the tip jar on the website. And if you'd like to help the podcast out without having to spend any money on it, you can do a surprising amount of work to help Sleepy Time Tales simply by telling them about it. Whether in person or on social media, if you think people will benefit from listening to Sleepy Time Tales, just let them know. And that's enough of that. Let's get back to learning about geology. We're returning once again to the very popular The Elements of Geology by William Harmon Norton. And we're picking up learning all about the geology of North America. The Laurentian peneplain. This is the name given to a denuded surface on very ancient rocks, which extends from the Arctic Ocean to the St. Lawrence River and Lake Superior, with small areas also in northern Wisconsin and New York. Throughout this U-shaped area, which encloses Hudson Bay within its arms, the country rocks have the complicated and contorted structures which characterize mountain ranges. But the surface of the area is by no means mountainous. The skyline, when viewed from the divides, is unbroken by mountain peaks or rugged hills. The surface of the arm west of Hudson Bay is gently undulating, and that of the eastern arm has been roughened to low rolling hills and dissected in places by such deep river gorges as those of the Ottawa and Saguenay. This immense area may be regarded as an ancient peneplain, truncating the bases of long-vanished mountains and dissected after elevation. In the examples cited, the uplift has been a broad one, and to comparatively little height. Where peneplains have been uplifted to great height and have since been well dissected, and where they have been upfolded and broken and uptilted, their recognition becomes more difficult. Yet recent observers have found evidences of ancient lowland surfaces of erosion on the summits of the Allegheny Bridges, the Cascade Mountains, and the western slope of the Sierra Nevadas, the southern Appalachian region. We have here an example of an area, the latter part of whose geological history may be deciphered by means of its landforms. The generalized section of Figure 70, which passes from west to east across a portion of the region in eastern Tennessee, shows on the west a part of the broad Cumberland Plateau. On the east is the roughened upland platform, from which rise in the distance the peaks of the Great Smoky Mountains. The plateau, consisting of strata but little changed from their original flat-lying attitude, and the platform, developed on rocks of disordered structure made crystalline by heat and pressure, both stand at the common level of the line AB. They are separated by the Appalachian Valley, 40 miles wide, cut in strata which have been folded and broken into long, narrow blocks. The valley is traversed lengthwise by low, long ridges, the outcropping edges of the harder strata, which rise to about the same level, that of the line. Between these ridges stretch valley lowlands at the level excavated in the weaker rocks, while somewhat below them lie the channels of the present streams, now busily engaged in deepening their beds. The valley lowlands, were they planed by graded or ungraded streams? Have the present streams reached grade? Why did the streams cease widening the floors of the valley lowlands? How long since? When will they begin anew the work of lateral planation? What effect will this have on the ridges if the present cycle of erosion continues long uninterrupted? The ridges of the Appalachian Valley. Why do they stand above the valley lowlands? Why do their summits lie in about the same plane? Refilling the valleys intervening between these ridges with material removed by the streams, what is the nature of the surface thus restored? Does this surface accord with the rock structures on which it has been developed? How may it have been made? At what height did the land stand then compared with its present height? What elevation stood above the surface? Why? What name may you use to designate them? How does the length of time needed to develop the surface compare with that needed to develop the valley lowlands? The platform and plateau. Why did they stand at a common level? Of what surface may there be remnants? Is it accordant with the rock structure? How was it produced? What unconsumed masses overlook it? Did the rocks of the Appalachian Valley stand above the surface when it was produced? Did they then stand below it? Compare the time needed to develop the surface with that needed to develop CD. Which surface is the older? How many cycles of erosion are represented here? Give the erosion history of the region by cycles, beginning with the oldest, the work done in each and the work left undone. What brought each cycle to a close, and how long relatively it continued. Chapter 4. River Deposits. The characteristic features of river deposits and the forms which they assume may be treated under three heads. 1. Valley deposits. 2. Basin deposits. And 3. Deltas. Valley deposits. Floodplains are the surfaces of the alluvial deposits which streams bold along their courses at times of flood. A swift current then sweeps along the channel, while a shallow sheet of water moves slowly over the floodplain, spreading upon it a thin layer of sediment. It has been estimated that at each inundation of the Nile leaves a layer of fertilizing silt 0.03 of an inch thick over the floodplain of Egypt. Floodplains may consist of a thin spread of alluvium over the flat rock floor of a valley, which is being widened by the lateral erosion of a graded stream. Floodplain deposits of great thickness may be built by grading rivers, even in valleys whose rock floors have never been thus widened. A cross-section of a floodplain shows that it is highest next to the river, sloping gradually thence to the valley sides. These wide natural embankments are due to the fact that the river deposit is heavier near the bank, where the velocity of the silt-laden channel current is first checked by contact with the slower-moving overflow. Thus banked off from the stream, the outer portions of a floodplain are often ill-drained and swampy, and here vegetal deposits such as peat may be interbedded with river silts. A map of a wide floodplain such as that of the Mississippi or the Missouri shows that the courses of the tributaries on entering it are deflected downstream. Why? The grading streams by which floodplains are constructed gradually build their immediate banks and beds to higher and higher levels, and therefore find it easy at times of great floods to break the natural embankments and take new courses over the plain. In this way they grade each portion of it in turn by means of their shifting channels. Graded channels. A river actively engaging in grading its valley with coarse waste builds a floodplain of comparatively steep gradient, and often flows down it in a fairly direct course, and through a network of braided channels. From time to time a channel becomes choked with waste, and the water no longer finding room in it, breaks out and cuts and builds itself a new way, which reunites down valley with the other channels. Thus there becomes established a network of ever-changing channels, enclosing low islands of sand and gravel. Terraces. While grading streams thus tend to shift their channels, degrading streams, on the contrary, become more and more deeply entrenched in their valleys. It often occurs that a stream, after having built a floodplain, ceases to grade its bed because of a lessened load or for other reasons, such as an uplift of the region, and begins instead to degrade it. It leaves the original floodplain out of reach of even the highest floods. When again it reaches grade at a lower level, it produces a new floodplain by lateral erosion in the older deposits, remnants of which stand as terraces on one or both sides of the valley. In this way, a valley may be lined with a succession of terraces at different levels, each level representing an abandoned floodplain. Meanders. Valleys are graded with fine waste, form well-nigh level plains over which streams wind from side to side, of a direct course in symmetric bends, known as meanders, from the name of a winding river of Asia Minor. The giant Mississippi has developed meanders with a radius of 1½ miles, but the little creek may display on its meadow, as perfect curves, only a rod or so in radius. On the floodplain of either river or creek we may find examples of the successive stages in the development of the meander, from its beginning in the slight initial bend, sufficient to deflect the current against the outer side, eroding here and depositing on the inner side of the bend. It gradually reaches first the open bend, whose width and length are not far from equal, and later that of the horseshoe meander, whose diameter transverse to the course of the little stream is much greater than that parallel with it. Little by little the neck of land projecting into the bed is narrowed, until at last is cut through, and a cut-off is established. The old channel is now silted up at both ends, and becomes a crescentic lagoon or oxbow lake, which fills gradually to an arc-shaped, shallow depression. Floodplains characteristic of mature rivers. On reaching grade, a stream planes at a flat floor for its continually widening valley. Ever cutting on the outer bank of its curves, it deposits on the inner bank, scroll-like floodplain patches. For a while, the valley bluffs do not give its growing meanders room to develop to their normal size. But as planation goes on, the bluffs are driven back to the full width of the meander belt, and still later, to a width which gives room for broad stretches of floodplain on either side. Usually a river first attains grade near its mouth, and here first sinks its bed to near base level, extending its graded course upstream by cutting away barrier after barrier. It comes to have a widened and mature valley over its lower course, while its young headwaters are still busy eroding their beds. Its ungraded branches may thus bring down to its lower course more waste than it is competent to carry on to the sea. And here it degrades its bed and builds a floodplain in order to gain a steeper gradient and velocity enough to transport its load. As maturity is passed and the relief of the land is lessened, a smaller and smaller load of waste is delivered to the river. It now has energy to spare, and a grain degrades its valley, excavating its former floodplains and leaving them in terraces on either side, and at last in its old age sweeping them away. Alluvial cones and fans. In hilly and mountainous countries, one often sees on a valley side a conical or fan-shaped deposit of waste at the mouth of a lateral stream. The cause is obvious. The young branch has not been able as yet to wear its bed to accordant level with the already deepened valley of the master stream. It therefore builds its bed to grade at the point of juncture, but depositing here its load of waste. A load too heavy to be carried along the more gentle profile of the trunk valley. Where rivers descend from a mountainous region upon the plain, they may build alluvial fans of exceedingly gentle slope. Thus the rivers of the western side of the Sierra Nevada mountains have spread fans with a radius of as much as 40 miles, and a slope too slight to be detected without instruments, where they leave the rock-cut canyons in the mountains and descend upon the broad central valley of California. As a river flows over its fan, it commonly divides into a branchwork of shifting channels called distributaries, since they lead off the water from in the main stream. In this way, each part of the fan is degraded, and its symmetric form is preserved. Piedmont Plains. Mountain streams may build their confluent fans into widespread Piedmont, foot of the mountain, alluvial plains. These are especially characteristic of arid lands, where the streams wither as they flow out upon the thirsty lowlands, and are therefore compelled to lay down a large portion of their load. In humid climates, mountain-borne streams are usually competent to carry their loads of waste onto the sea, and have energy to spare to cut the lower mountain slopes into foothills. In arid regions, foothills are commonly absent, and the ranges rise, as from pedestals, above broad, sloping plains of stream-laid waste. The high plains. The rivers which flow eastward from the Rocky Mountains have united their fans in a continuous sheet of waste, which stretches forward from the base of the mountains for hundreds of miles, and in places is 500 feet thick. That the deposit was made in ancient times on land and not in the sea, is proved by the remains which it contains of land animals and plants of species now extinct. That it was laid by rivers and not by freshwater lakes is shown by its structure. Wide stretches of flat-lying clays and sands are interrupted by long narrow belts of gravel, which mark the channels of the ancient streams. Gravels and sands are often cross-bedded, and their well-worn pebbles may be identified with the rocks of the mountains. After building the sheet of waste, the streams ceased to erode and began the work of destruction. Large uneroded remnants, their surfaces flat as a floor, remain as the high plains of western Kansas and Nebraska. River deposits in subsiding troughs. To a geologist, the most important river deposits are those which gather in areas of gradual subsidence. They are often of vast extent and immense thickness, and such deposits of past geological ages have not infrequently been preserved, with all their records of the time in which they were built, by being carried below the level of the sea, to be brought to light by a later uplift. On the other hand, river deposits which remain above base levels of erosion are swept away comparatively soon. The Great Valley of California is a monotonously level plain of great fertility, 400 miles in length and 50 miles in average width, built of waste swept down by streams from the mountain ranges which enclose it. The Sierra Nevada on the east and the Coast Range on the west. On the west slopes at the foot of the bordering hills, coarse gravels and even boulders are left, while over the interior of the slow-flowing streams at times of flood spread wide sheets of silt. Organic deposits are now forming by the decay of vegetation in swampy reedlands, and in shallow lakes which occupy depressions left by the degrading streams. Deep borings show that this great trough is filled to a depth of at least 2,000 feet below sea level, with recent unconsolidated sands, and silts containing logs of wood and freshwater shells. These are land deposits, and the absence of any marine deposits among them proves that the region has not been invaded by the sea since the accumulation began. It has therefore been slowly subsiding, and its streams, though continually carried below grade, have not yet been able to erode the surface as rapidly as the region sank, and have maintained it, as at present, slightly above sea level. The Indo-Gangetic Plain, spread by the Brahmaputra, the Ganges, and the Indus River systems, stretches for 1,600 miles along the southern base of the Himalaya Mountains and occupies an area of 300,000 square miles. It consists of the floodplains of the master streams and the confluent fans of the tributaries which issue from the mountains on the north. Larger areas are subject to overflow each season of flood, and still larger tracts mark abandoned floodplains below which the rivers have now cut their beds. The plan is built of far-stretched beds of clay, penetrated by streaks of sand, and also of gravel near the mountains. Beds of impure peat occur in it, and it contains freshwater shells and the bones of land animals of species now living in northern India. At Lucknow, an artesian well was sunk to 1,000 feet below sea level, without reaching the bottom of these river-laid sands and silts, proving a slow subsidence with which the degrading rivers have kept pace. Warped valleys. It is not necessary that an area should sink below sea level in order to be filled with stream-swept waste. High valleys among growing mountain ranges may suffer warping, or may be blockaded by rising mountain folds athwart them. Where the deformation is rapid enough, the river may be ponded, and the valley filled with lake-laid sediments. Even when the river is able to maintain its right of way, it may yet have its declivity so lessened that it is compelled to grade its course continually, filling the valley with river deposits which may grow to an enormous thickness. Behind the outer ranges of the Himalayan mountains lie several waste-filled valleys, the largest of which are Kashmir and Nepal, the former being an alluvial plain about as large as the state of Delaware. The rivers which drain these plains have already cut down their outlet gorges sufficiently to begin the task of the removal of the broad accumulations which they have brought in from the surrounding mountains. The present floodplains lie as much as some hundreds of feet below wide alluvial terraces, which mark their former levels. Indeed, the horizontal beds of the Hundis Valley have been trenched to the depth of nearly 3,000 feet by the Sutlej River. These deposits are recent or sub-recent, for there have been found at various levels the remains of land plants and land and freshwater shells, and in some of the bones of such animals as the hyena and the goat, of species of genera now living. Such soft deposits cannot be expected to endure through any considerable length of future time. The rapid erosion to which their great height above the level of the sea will subject them. Characteristics of river deposits. The examples just cited teach clearly the characteristic features of extensive river deposits. These deposits consist of broad, flat-lying sheets of clay and fine sand left by the overflow at time of flood, and traversed here and there by long, narrow strips of coarse, cross-bedded sands and gravels thrown down by the swifter currents of the shifting channels. Occasional beds of muck mark the sites of shallow lakelets or freshwater swamps. The various strata also contain some remains of the countless myriads of animals and plants which live upon the surface of the plain, as it is in process of building. River shells such as the mussels, land shells such as those of snails, and bones of fishes and such land animals as suffer drowning at times of flood, are mired in swampy places, logs of wood, and the stems and leaves of plants, are examples of the variety of the remains of land and freshwater organisms, which are entombed in river deposits, and sealed away as a record of the life of the time, and as proof that the deposits were laid by streams and not beneath the sea. Basin deposits. Deposits in dry basins. On desert areas without outlet to the sea, as on the Great Basin of the United States and the deserts of Central Asia, stream-swept waste accumulates indefinitely. The rivers of the surrounding mountains, fed by the rains and melting snows of these comparatively moist elevations, dry and soak away as they come down upon the arid plains. They are compelled to lay aside their entire load of waste, eroded from the mountain valleys, in fans which grow to enormous size, reaching in some instances thousands of feet in thickness. The monotonous levels of Turkestan include vast alluvial tracts, now in process of building by the floods of the frequently shifting channels of the Oxus and other rivers of the region. For about 700 miles from its mouth in Aral Lake, the Oxus receives no tributaries, since even the larger branches of its system are lost in a network of distributaries and choked with desert sands before they reach their master stream. These are grading rivers which have channels but no valleys, spread their muddy floods, which in the case of the Oxus sometimes equal the average volume of the Mississippi, far and wide over the plain, washing the bases of the desert dunes. Playas. In the arid interior basins, the central depressions may be occupied by playas, plains of fine mud washed forward from the margins. In the wet season, the playa is covered with a thin sheet of muddy water. A playa lake, supplied usually by some stream at flood. In the dry season, the lake evaporates. The river which fed it retreats, and there is left to view a hard, smooth, level floor of sun-baked and sun-cracked yellow clay, utterly devoid of vegetation. In the Black Rock Desert of Nevada, a playa lake spreads over an area 50 miles long and 20 miles wide. In summer it disappears. The Quinn River which feeds it shrinks back 100 miles towards its source, leaving an absolutely barren floor of clay, level as the sea. Lake deposits. Regarding lakes as part of river systems, we may now notice the characteristic features of the deposits in lake basins. Soundings in lakes of considerable size and depth show that their bottoms are being covered with tine clays. Sand and gravel are found along their margins, being brought in by streams and worn by waves from the shore. But there are no tidal or other strong currents to sweep coarse waste out from shore to any considerable distance. Where fine clays are now found on the land in even horizontal layers, containing the remains of freshwater animals and plants, uncut by channels tilled with cross-bedded gravels, and sands and bordered by beach deposits of coarse waste, we may safely infer the existence of ancient lakes. Marl. Marl is a soft, whitish deposit of carbonate of lime, mingled often with more or less of clay, accumulated in small lakes whose feeding springs are charged with carbonate of lime, and into which little waste is washed from the land. Such lakelets are not infrequent on the surface of the younger drift sheets of Michigan and northern Indiana, where the beds of marl, sometimes as much as 40 feet thick, are utilized in the manufacture of Portland cement. The deposit results from the decay of certain aquatic plants, which secrete lime carbonate from the water, from the decomposition of the calcareous shells of tiny mollusks, which live in countless numbers on the lake floor, and in some cases apparently from chemical precipitation. Peat. We have seen how lakelets are extinguished by the decaying remains of the vegetation which they support. A section of such a fossil lake shows that below the growing mosses and other plants of the surface of the bog lies a spongy mass composed of dead vegetable tissue, which passes downward gradually into peat, a dense, dark brown carbonaceous deposit in which, to the unaided eye, little or no trace of vegetable structure remains. When dried, peat forms a fuel of some value, and is used either cut into slabs and dried, or pressed into bricks by machinery. When vegetation decays in open air, the carbon of its tissues, taken from the atmosphere by the leaves, is oxidized and returned to it in its original form of carbon dioxide. But decomposing in the presence of water, as in a bog, where the oxygen of the air is excluded, the carbonaceous matter of plants accumulates in deposits of peat. Peat bogs are numerous in regions lately abandoned by glacier ice, where river systems are so immature that the initial depressions left in the sheet of drift spread over the country have not yet been drained. 1/10 of the surface of Ireland is said to be covered with peat, and small bogs abound in the drift-covered area of New England, in the states lying as far west as the Missouri River. In Massachusetts alone, it has been reckoned that there are 15 billion cubic feet of peat, the largest bog occupying several thousand acres. Much larger swamps occur on the young coastal plain of the Atlantic from New Jersey to Florida. The Dismal Swamp, for example, in Virginia and North Carolina is 40 miles across. It is covered with a dense growth of water-loving trees such as the cypress and black gum. The center of the swamp is occupied by Lake Drummond, a shallow lake 7 miles in diameter, with banks of pure peat, and still narrowing from the encroachment of vegetation along its borders. Salt lakes. In arid climates, a lake rarely receives sufficient inflow to enable it to rise to the basin rim and find an outlet. Before this height is reached, its surface becomes large enough to discharge by evaporation into the dry air the amount of water that is supplied by streams. As such a lake has no outlet, the minerals in solution brought into it by its streams cannot escape from the basin. The lake water becomes more and more heavily charged with such substances as common salt, and the sulfates and carbonates of lime, of soda and of potash, and these are thrown down from solution, one after another, as the point of saturation for each mineral is reached. Carbonate of lime, the least soluble, and often the most abundant mineral brought in, is the first to be precipitated. As concentration goes on, gypsum, which is insoluble in a strong brine, is deposited, and afterwards common salt. As the saltness of the lake varies with the seasons and with climatic changes, gypsum and salt are laid in alternate beds, and are interleaved with sedimentary clays spread from the waste brought in by the streams at times of flood. Few forms of life can live in bodies of salt water so concentrated that chemical deposits take place, and hence the beds of salt, gypsum, and silt of such lakes are quite barren of the remains of life. Similar deposits are precipitated by the concentration of seawater in lagoons and arms of the sea cut off from the ocean. Lakes Bonneville and Lahontan. These names are given to extinct lakes which once occupied large areas in the Great Basin, the former in Utah, the latter in northwestern Nevada. Their records remain in old horizontal beach lines which they drew along their mountainous shores at the different levels at which they stood, and in the deposits of their beds. At its highest stage, Lake Bonneville, then 1,000 feet deep, overflowed to the north and was a freshwater lake. As it shrank below the outlet, it became more and more salty, and the Great Salt Lake, its withered residue, is now depositing salt along its shores. And its strong brine lime carbonate is insoluble, and that brought in by streams is thrown down at once in the form of travertine. Lake Lahontan never had an outlet. The first chemical deposits to be made along its shores were deposits of travertine, in places 80 feet thick. Its floor was spread with fine clays which must have been laid in deep, still water, and which are charged with the salts absorbed by them as the briny water of the lake dried away. These sedimentary clays are in two divisions, the upper and lower each being about 100 feet thick. They are separated by heavy deposits of well-rounded, cross-bedded gravels and sands. similar to those spread at the present time by the intermittent streams of arid regions. A similar record is shown in the old floors of Lake Bonneville. What conclusions do you draw from these facts as to the history of these ancient lakes? And I think I'm going to leave that there. If you are interested in picking up where I'm leaving off, as always, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night and sweet dreams.